I declare open this public hearing of the Select Committee on Nuclear Energy for the inquiry into nuclear power generation in Australia. I now welcome Australian Energy Council, Cauldron and Squadron Energy to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and capacity in which you appear before the committee? We'll start with you, Mr Fisher.
Yeah, Jonathan Fisher, the CEO of Cauldron Energy. We're an ASX uranium company.
Thank you.
Louisa Kinnear, the CEO of the Australian Energy Council.
Thank you.
David Feeney, General Manager, Wholesale and Environment for the Australian Energy Council.
Thank you.
Jason Willoughby, Chairman of Squadron Energy.
Thank you. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Before I invite you to make a brief opening statement and then we proceed to discussions, would you please state if you are a current or former member of a political party, a union or an investor in the renewable or nuclear industries, please?
Yeah, not union, not political party. I'm a shareholder in my uranium company, and I was formerly involved in Tellus Holdings, which developed the radioactive waste repository in Australia, so I retain a minority interest in that.
Thank you.
No, nothing from
Nothing?
me.
Nothing.
No, other than being chair of a renewable energy company.
Thank you. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussions. We'll start with you, Mr Fisher.
Thanks, Chair. My name is Jonathan Fisher. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm here today because I've actually got, besides being here as the CEO of Cauldron, I've got varied experience across the radiological value chain. And so I thought I would focus my submission on those parts of the value chain where I do have the most experience. In addition to being the CEO of Cauldron, I was instrumental in driving the approvals and financing of Australia's only radioactive waste repository, which is a Tellus Holdings Sandy Ridge facility operating in WA. I therefore have experience with respect to siting a facility in accordance with the International Atomic Energy Agency site selection criteria and the economics behind a radioactive waste repository and our abilities to do it safely in this country. This is an important aspect, I feel, given some of the previous evidence before this committee, as well as previous comments by members of our government, including the Energy Minister, who suggests that radioactive waste is a problem which cannot be solved. There is broad international consensus that action is needed to decarbonise the global economy. There's also broad international consensus, although perhaps not in Australia, that the world will not hit net zero without nuclear energy. Now, Australia may or may not choose to build reactors here, and I think that's what we're talking about today. But even if we don't, we have a moral obligation to mine our uranium, and we have more of it than any other place in the world, and supply it to our strategic trading partners and our allies who are desperate for it. In this bifurcated world where energy security of supply is a paramount concern, there is an alarming shortage of Western-aligned sources of uranium, as well as actually Western conversion enrichment. Recently, the Triple Nuclear Pledge has been signed with many hundreds of gigawatts of new baseload carbon-free energy to be delivered. A lack of available uranium is one of the many factors which could mean that that target may not be achieved. If we are serious in helping the globe to decarbonise, after all it's global warming, not Australian warming, perhaps we should not only focus on reducing Australia's relatively small emissions in a global context, but we also must maximise the assistance we give to other larger economies so they can decarbonise. In fact, the WA Labor government is of that view, where we should do this even at the expense of increasing our own emissions. This has been in the context of selling more gas from WA to help global reliance on coal from our trading partners. This argument works a lot better if you start talking about uranium for coal substitution, in fact. If we remove the uranium mining bans in WA and Queensland and let our industry flourish, we can help other countries offset more emissions than Australia's entire carbon inventory of approximately 444 million tonnes of carbon. So let that sink in. The impacts of uranium export and therefore more nuclear energy globally, not necessarily in Australia, are considerable. With increased uranium mining helping others to decarbonise, it provides more flexibility on the apparatus we may choose in Australia to decarbonise our own economy if we already know that we're making a massive impact on the world's other emissions. Uranium represents the most concentrated form of green energy on the planet. Our government wants to be a green energy export superpower, in fact, and they say that to do that through the export of hydrogen. Now, we can do it, but we can much more likely do it through uranium. We already have heard from Geoscience Australia and earlier in this committee that there's absolutely no scientific basis for uranium bans. So if our federal government is serious about climate change, it can perhaps help in changing those state-based issues. In the event that Australia does build nuclear reactors, it makes sense for Australia to have a stable and domestic source of uranium in order to provide energy security. An area where I understand that the community may have more reservations, to some extent built upon frankly deliberate misinformation or perhaps unconscious bias through absorption of incorrect information through cultural phenomena such as The Simpsons, is radioactive waste. As I have said many times before, rad waste is not green, it's not sludgy, and it doesn't leak out of drums. As a member of the team that delivered the holistic suite of approvals and financing of development of Australia's first commercially operated radioactive waste repository, I have confidence in our ability to handle this material in a world's best practice manner. We should focus here on where Australia is a world leader. We are one of only a handful of countries where the private sector has been successful in building a rad waste repository, which is a credit actually to the innovation of our private sector, but it's actually a credit to our government and our laws that allow such facilities to be built. And that gives us an extraordinary head start as we look to build infrastructure for the next stage of the nuclear industry in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just got a brief statement that I'll read out. The Australian Energy Council welcomes the opportunity to contribute to the inquiry into nuclear power generation in Australia. The AEC, representing businesses in the wholesale and retail energy markets, supports a net zero emissions target by 2050 and a 55% emissions reduction target by 2035. I should say that our members also supply energy in retail to almost 10 million customers across Australia. So while we acknowledge the potential role of nuclear energy in Australia's energy future, the AEC would like to emphasise the need for careful consideration of its implications. While the AEC advocates for a technology-neutral approach, nuclear energy should be subject to rigorous cost and capability assessments before any further decisions are made. Furthermore, we would like to stress that the energy transition needs to continue at a significant pace to ensure a cost-effective, low-emissions transition as thermal generation is phased out. This means that the current focus should be on ensuring the right investment signals are in place for new and replacement generation needed over the next 10 years, such as wind, supported by firmed energy from gas, pumped hydro, and other forms of long-duration storage as they emerge.
Mr. Feeney, do you have anything to add, or you're okay with that?
Good,
Thank
thanks.
you. Mr. Willoughby.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation to address the committee. I'm here representing Squadron Energy, Australia's leading renewable energy company. We are a 100% Australian-owned company. We have 5 operational wind farms, 3 in New South Wales, 2 in Victoria, and we have a further 2 wind farms under construction in New South Wales and Queensland. What we aim to do is our vision, if you like, is to protect the environment for future generations by leading the energy transition. And at the heart of what we do is making sure that the communities that we are located and that we operate in share in the long-term benefits of this energy shift. To date, Squadron Energy has generated enough electricity to avoid 7 million tonnes of CO2 emissions. We've created 2,100 jobs, and we've injected $350 million into regional communities. We sell renewable power to key corporates like the Commonwealth Bank, ANZ, Woolworths, Nestle, Fujitsu, amongst others. And we have a pipeline of projects in development for both wind, solar, as well as battery and gas firming projects. Importantly, we also have Australia's only energy import terminal located down at Port Kembla, and I'm proud to say that we have officially completed construction of that facility this week. That's going to be a really important facility because that is going to facilitate gas into New South Wales and Victoria, which is going to be required to help firm up the renewable generation that we're going to be building out in those states and help address some of the looming gas shortfalls that have been identified in both of those states. And importantly, it will be able to do that without requiring new gas field developments in either New South Wales or Victoria. At the moment, Australia relies on coal generation for about 2/3 of its power. And the vast majority of those coal-fired power stations are nearing the end of their technical and economic life. and replacing those coal generators. It's what we, when we refer to the energy transition, that's essentially what we're referring to. We think that the energy transition is crucially important for two reasons. The first is an environmental reason. In 2024, we've experienced some unwelcome firsts. We're on track to have the hottest year on record. In Australia, we experienced our hottest winter day in August. The majority of our emissions, a third of our emissions in Australia come from the power generation section. If we're going to reduce emissions, we have to address the emissions coming from our power generation sector. But there's a second, equally important and equally urgent reason why the energy transition is important, and that's an economic reason. As I said, we rely heavily on coal generation for our power source, and the reality is that those coal plants are getting older, they're aged, they're becoming increasingly unreliable and expensive to operate. The consequences of having a power system which relies on such aged infrastructure was really evident in 2022. And we saw that a third of the coal generation fleet wasn't able to operate, either because of issues at the plants or issues at the coal mines that supplied them. And as a result of that, power prices went to unprecedented levels. And for the first time in its then 24-year history, the national electricity market needed to be suspended. I just want to emphasise that point. The high power prices that were experienced in 2022 and the consequences that we're feeling in 23 and 24 were due directly to the inability of the coal plant to perform and to be essentially being unavailable to operate. We've had a lot of discussion recently around replacing those coal generators. There is an urgency. If we want to step away from an environment where we're going to have continued high power prices, we need to step away from those old age coal plants. We need to replace those coal plants as quickly as we can with the lowest cost generation solution that's available. And the lowest cost generation that is available today is wind and solar and battery firmed by gas. There's been a lot of discussion around cost of nuclear, but I think there's a general consensus that the absolute earliest that you would see an operational nuclear plant is in 15 years. Waiting for 15 years for a nuclear plant is locking in higher power prices for 15 years. There is an urgency that is required to address the power prices created by these old coal plants. And when we look at the importance of the transition comes back to how quickly can we replace the coal generation with the lowest cost solution that we have today. If nuclear was economic and if it was available today, we'd be looking at it. But it's not, and we are focused on replacing the coal plants with that wind, solar, battery, firm generation solution, whilst at the same time putting the communities and local regions at the centre of everything we do, because we don't have an energy transition if we don't look after the communities.
Thank you, Mr. Willoughby, and we'll go to Mr. Kennedy first. He's got some things he's got to do shortly. So, Mr. Kennedy.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question's to Mr. Feeney. Mr. Feeney, we've heard extensive contributions about how nuclear power plants can be built safely from earthquakes and natural disasters. We've not had the same level of feedback about waste facilities. Could you comment on how safely we're able to store and manage spent fuel in facilities such as Sandy Ridge or other facilities?
Who was that for, Mr. Kennedy? Was that for Mr. Feeney from the Australian Energy Council? Was that Mr. Fisher from Cauldron?
Probably me.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, that was for Mr. Fisher. My apologies.
All good, buddy. We're just double checking.
Yeah, that's it.
It fits in a little bit better.
No, not Cauldron. That was for my mistake. I'm sorry. I don't have you all in front of me. I'm trying to look from my my notes. Excuse my.
Yeah. So,
Mr. Fisher.
yeah, earthquakes and waste storage.
Yes.
Sandy Ridge went through. And to be clear, Sandy Ridge is a low-level waste facility, but it went through a full International Atomic Energy Site Selection Criteria and a full radiation safety case, and the level of approvals is quite staggering. And the modelling done on on Sandy Ridge and any other waste facility, an earthquake in Australia will not be an issue whatsoever, notwithstanding if there was a much larger earthquake than you've seen on the East Coast. In addition, we did things like strange human intrusion event models like flying a 747 into the facility. Which is something that you do obviously after 9/11, and the facility parts with flying colours. So, earthquakes is absolutely not an issue with respect to waste.
And then Australia's already got, already is a nuclear nation with Opal. We use it a lot in medical. We've signed up for AUKUS. The Albanese government is already looking for a permanent facility for waste. Can you sort of talk about what Australia's future requirements are to store fuel from what we already have committed to?
Yeah, so we don't have, we will eventually have high-level spent fuel from submarine requirements. Obviously, the way submarines are designed and the new ones, you don't have any of that until the end of life of the submarine. But on the way that AUKUS is currently going, I think we get some second-hand submarines to start with, so they'll come along in, say, 20 years. And those high-level wastes would need to be permanently isolated at a federal high-level waste facility, which the government has committed to building. It would make sense, and again, having built a radioactive waste repository, it makes sense to maximise the amount of tonnes you can put into the one facility. The overall amount of waste movements back and forth are quite de minimis. It's not as if you can have 3 trucks rocking up at one day. And so you can have the same sort of level of receival infrastructure and just handling one shipment every so often from civilian as well as military. And so while there may need to be some physical separation on the site to fit within the Defence Department's requirement for being on the future defence estate, that can certainly be done. So from a cost perspective, it makes sense to basically co-locate.
Final question from me. The inquiry's heard evidence that it's not usual for opposition parties to consult government agencies on opposition policy. Geoscience Australia stated earthquake risks are extremely low in Australia compared to other nations that host nuclear power. They noted that Australia is one of the most geologically stable continents going round. Given all this information, do you believe some actors in Australian society, potentially the Labor Party too, if you want to comment on that, have been trying to stoke fear about the extreme hazards, earthquakes, and the risks, hurricanes, tornadoes, and the risk that will bear with regards to nuclear?
Just before you answer that, Mr. Fisher, I don't think that we need to start throwing stones here, Mr. Kennedy, because if you want to do that, we can play the game quite well back. So I think we should just reframe that question a little bit differently and
Answer it differently?
And just ask the question again a little bit differently, and then you can answer, Mr. Fisher.
Yeah.
Okay. Reframing it, we have heard evidence, and we've heard a lot of questions as well about whether Australia is geographically stable enough to host nuclear. Do you think these are real concerns, or do you think these are inflammatory concerns?
I think there's absolutely zero concerns whatsoever around the geological stability of Australia. To be clear, there are issues that we're all here talking about. How does nuclear fit into the grid? And that's a relevant discussion. I think it would be beneficial if all of us tried to focus on those kind of things, and maybe we could provide some calm words around the fact that these other matters are not. If we've only got a certain amount of time to debate this, they're not the issues we should talk about. We should talk about the real issues.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Chester.
Thank you, Chair. Willie, just in relation to your evidence that regions are the centre of everything you do, can you just run through for me what sort of code of conduct or best practice you have in place in terms of consultation with communities? Because evidence we've heard, particularly from Central Queensland, was there some level of concern in the community about the way some of these larger scale industrial renewable projects were treating local communities? I'm interested to know on your approach as a company.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chester. Our company's been in operation, the origins go back to 2007. We've been doing consultations with communities for a long period of time, and it's really evident to us that the success of a project really depends on the success of the support within a community. And we look at a community in it's not a homogenous environment. There are folks who are going to host infrastructure, there are neighbours to folks, and then there's the local communities. And they all have different requirements, different needs, and they all need to be addressed to make sure that there is sufficient and broad support amongst all sectors of those communities. From our perspective, one of the things that we're very proud of is that the very first interaction that you have with someone from Squadron is a permanent employee of the company. Our shareholders, Andrew and Nicola, are both from the country. Their bush pedigree, their focus on regional areas really flows through the values of the company. So it's a high priority for us to make sure that the first engagement, the ongoing engagement that the communities and landowners have with people from Squadron represent the values and the engagements that we want to have in long term. We're looking for long-term relationships. This is not a transaction. We're long-term owners of projects. We're here for the duration and want to be a valuable member of communities. I think one of the key areas, I guess, that we're focused on, particularly in the Central West around Dubbo, we have a number of projects around there, is coming up with solutions that address some of the pinch points that come for communities in regional areas. So, for example, one of the initiatives that we are rolling out around our Yungala project, which is currently under construction at Wellington, is to really focus on improving internet connectivity for all of the population within a 20-kilometre radius of the wind farm. And we're doing that by rolling out a mesh network, providing the infrastructure, paying for that, paying for the data that's going to be used, and then providing some grants to those landowners who want it. It's a voluntary program for them to invest in agricultural technology, because we think there's a real opportunity there to support the farming communities to improve productivity, whether it's from a time perspective, checking on water tank pumps and levels to soil temperatures or moisture levels. So
just to be clear, Mr. Willoughby, that is a decision by your company, not a legislated obligation by the state or federal government.
That's correct, and it's just one of the things that we're trying to do is set a standard for others to follow. And we think it is important that there are standards. We think that it is important that there's a code of conduct, and we've been working with a number of representatives to come up with a industry-wide code of conduct. We believe absolutely that the industry needs to perform to the highest standards to give the certainty and engage in the right manner with communities, so that they don't feel that they're getting a poor outcome because they're engaging with renewable energy owners.
Is there any transparency around how much a landholder would get paid, for example, per turbine from company to company, or are they subject to non-disclosure agreements?
I think it depends a little bit per company. I mean, from our perspective, we think transparency is really important. One of the things that we do, for example, is when we talk to landowners for prospective projects, we'll take them to one of our existing projects, introduce them to the existing landowners, and leave the room. I think it's
but there's no set schedule where a landholder who's approached by a company will know in advance that a turbine of a certain capacity should return a certain amount to the landholder. There's no actual schedule of payments that a landholder should expect.
I don't believe there's an industry guide sheet with that sort of information, no.
So I guess I'm getting to this point about code of conduct and best practice. I don't see how the regional communities have confidence if they don't have that transparency around what an individual landholder can expect to earn or what a community can expect to benefit from, unless it's legislated in some way. So I guess I'm floating the question, should that be legislated in some way?
Look, it's really important that the standards are raised and maintained. If that requires legislation and regulation, we'd be supportive of that.
Thanks, Mr. Willoughby. Sorry, Mr. Fisher, just returning to the questions my colleague around the hesitation around waste disposal and safety issues. What feedback have you received or from communities impacted by any of the projects you've been involved in around radioactive waste disposal activities. Has it been a positive experience? Can you expand on that at all?
Yeah, I can. Echo what you said. Community consultation is absolutely critical, and that's something that we did as TELUS over a prolonged period. Additionally, we signed a native title agreement with our Indigenous owners, and that agreement is going well. We've had no issues with respect to waste management. It is all done to an extraordinarily high degree. I often joke that you can take diesel, for example, you can truck it up the road in a normal canister. As soon as you call it diesel contaminated soil, you have to triple line it. There are very high standards that go for waste management, and our communities have been broadly supportive.
I was also interested in your comments, and without wishing to paraphrase, but basically suggesting that part of Australia being a good global citizen in terms of this global challenge would be to remove bans on uranium mining in various states. Can you expand on that at all? I mean, what would that do? Would it mean that Australia would end up exporting more uranium, be more job opportunities, or do you think it'd be business as usual? What would actually change if some of these bans were removed?
So right now we export around 5,000 to 6,000 tonnes, and that all comes out of South Australia. When the Northern Territory was producing, we got as high as around 12,000 tonnes, so it's come off about 50% roughly. And there are bans in WA and Queensland. Now, even at around 5,000 tonnes, ASNO does a calc, which assumes a uranium for black coal substitution, and it says that the 5,000 tonnes of uranium that we export at the moment helps avoid 200 million tonnes of carbon a year. And so, based on our current carbon inventory, which is, I think at the last reporting was about 450 million tonnes per annum, if we remove the bans on uranium mining in WA and Queensland, and we can quite easily, get mines in operation, which would see us go from back up to 12, maybe up to 20 million pounds of uranium a year, Australia hits net zero on that machination, right? Where we're helping our trading partners decarbonise. So it's an extraordinary high leverage thing we can do. We hope that the federal government, it is mostly a state-based issue, but there are things the government can do to help move that along.
And just finally, thanks, Chair, just finally in terms of the safe operation of uranium mines and the workforce required and their remuneration, can you reflect at all on are these well-paid jobs? Can you operate these mines best and safely with the existing workforce, or what's required?
Yeah, so uranium's been safely mined in South Australia for 40 years. No one's going to shy away from the issues that have happened in the Territory, where there's obviously the rehabilitation rangers going on at the moment, and that has been a difficult project, subject to approvals that are just well outdated. We wouldn't build a project in that way, shape or form now. And yes, uranium jobs are well sought after. They're highly paid, and we can, taking a WA experience, the CCI WA put out a report last year or earlier this year that said there could be 9,000 jobs in that, which helps offset job losses that have been occurring in nickel, lithium, and iron ore in WA. So it can be a very good benefit for the economy.
Thank you, Mr. Chester. Just following on from a little bit of this, Mr. Fisher, what's the global demand currently for uranium?
So usage in a reactor?
Demand. Just demand.
180
is demand
180
being
million
reached
pounds.
right now?
180 million pounds.
Yeah, okay. How much is being mined around the world right now?
Last figure's about 134 million pounds.
Yeah, okay. So there's a little bit of room there. Very good.
So to be clear, so we're not mining enough of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And just following on from one of Mr. Kennedy's questions, do you think the Geoscience Australia needs to make sure that the 7 sites around Australia. They need to do the right studies and do the right inquiries to make sure that land is actually safe to have a nuclear power station on. The reason why I ask that, because in the Hunter we've had over 50 earthquakes in a 3-month period, and people are genuinely concerned.
Yeah.
So do you think they need to go and do that work, or do you think it's just okay to go and build one there without doing that?
So I'm not sure if you've ever built a major project, Dan, but obviously geotech's, one of the things that you absolutely get right. Whether it's Geoscience Australia or a consulting firm, I don't know who does it, but that geotech absolutely will be done. And it'll pass with flying colours. Yes. Australia is a geologically stable country. They build reactors, on the Rim of Fire. We can build one here geologically, at least. Yeah.
No, thank you. I just wanted to follow that on from Mr. Kelly's question, because there's genuine concern in my area. That's
I think we can give your constituents absolute comfort, but we probably need to be proactive in giving them those positive messages.
Thank you. And do you also supply critical minerals into the renewables energy supply chain as well as mining uranium, or do you just mine uranium?
So I would like to mine uranium. Uranium's banned in WA at the moment, where our project is. We've got a lot of uranium, but we can't extract it at the moment. We have a early stage exploration project for nickel copper in WA as well, but that's not currently being invested in, given the global market for nickel at the moment.
Yep. Do you support a slowdown in renewable energy generation?
Do you mean a slowdown in the rate of increase, or a slowdown? I do not support a decline in the renewable energy generation. No.
Okay, that's good. And are you concerned with the state-owned nuclear power policy that could slow down investment in renewables in this country? Are you concerned about that?
Yeah, the state-owned concept. And that is a model that you've seen around the world, where the governments can backstop certain things under the construction, and then quite often, which is what has happened, like in the UK, is federally they build it, and then after a period of operations they sell it. I wouldn't be surprised if we did that.
Okay.
Am I concerned that would impact renewable energy? No.
Do you think the coalition should be honest with the Australian public then, if they, as you just said then, that usually a government would build it?
Usually, I said it can.
It can happen. Yeah. Do you think they should be honest with the Australian public and say whether they're going to keep it in their hands or whether they're going to move it on?
Look, I think governments, that whole sort of concept of privatisation and recycling of capital is something that happens across industry. I obviously, honestly, do not know if they've had that in their thinking heads or not. I haven't spoken to them about it. But it's something that, for example, if we ended up having, I don't know what their policy is, 10 reactors, and you end up selling off a couple, which would be extremely valuable to then finance the next 2, so you could start recycling your capital. I mean, from a commercial perspective, that makes sense.
We're very unsure at how many reactors they're going to have as well, because there's no detail on it.
I believe that's coming, yeah.
Yes.
It will be good to see.
Ms. Kinner and Mr. Feeney, do you think nuclear power could be deployed in Australia on a time frame that would see nuclear play a significant role in replacing the existing coal-fired power stations? Before 2040?
Yeah, in the current environment, no, we don't.
Yep.
Our view would be that, while you shouldn't necessarily, I think, exclude nuclear from a technology mix over the longer term, to be able to replace those ageing thermal assets, really in the next 10 to 15 years, it's highly unlikely that nuclear is going to be a viable replacement. Mr.
Feeney, do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I'd add is that the closure profile, is an obligation that asset owners need to let AEMO know, well in advance, and so
4 years, I think it is. Yes.
Yeah, so that's publicly available, information about what that closure profile looks like, and a lot of the closures happen well ahead of the availability of nuclear.
Thank you. Are you concerned about the impacts of a plan for the Commonwealth to build, own, and operate nuclear plants would have for private investment in generation and storage? Do you worry that such a nuclear policy, if implemented, would stifle investment, and what would be the consequences if it did for reliability and affordability for power, given the answer above about that?
Yeah, look, something I think that we're very cognizant of is we need to get the signals for investment right now. In a transitioning market like the one that we are in, we know those investment signals aren't quite right at the moment. And knowing that really we need to have sufficient existing and new replacement generation in place over the next 10 years, it's really a decision that needs to be made quite quickly and very soon around what those investment signals are. And certainly I think they're just the signals required really for mature forms of generation that we know work well in our system and are complementary to the existing mix. So things like wind, long duration storage like pumped hydro or other emerging technologies, and certainly gas are most likely to deliver the lowest cost solution.
And how do we encourage that investment when you said that there is an issue in the market right now with that investment coming in?
Yeah, so I think we're already seeing activity around that. So obviously you've got the capacity investment scheme, which the current government has introduced. That's certainly stimulating that investment. Now we just need to make sure that investment is fully realised. Obviously we've got the Future Market Design Task Force that's just been announced, and I think that's going to consider a range of investment mechanisms. But certainly I think the other thing that we've seen is South Australia governments come out, I think, with their own capacity investment mechanism, which includes gas. That's something that we very much welcome, and we're looking forward to having those conversations.
Do you think the Coalition's 5-page policy, do you think that is concerning some of these investors and the investment coming in, or do you think it's just a bump along the road?
I think what we would hate to happen is for progress on the transition to be stalled because we're focused on technologies that may not be available at this point in time. So what we would hate, I think, is for investment to be slowed or decisions on investment be slowed down as a result while we, I think, assess a technology solution that could be viable but should probably be viable under the same investment signals as other generation that's currently available.
No worries. How would you describe the private sector's appetite for investing into nuclear energy?
Look, I can't speak sort of for individual members. It's certainly not being considered by our membership base at the moment on the basis that there is a ban in place. For example, I think, if that ban was removed, and the investment signals were right, it may well be something that members would consider into the future, but I wouldn't say it's top of mind for them right now.
Yeah, okay. And my final question before I go to Mr. Burnell. Do you believe that nuclear power plan that has been put forward before Australians would lower their energy prices, or do you think it's at risk of doing the opposite due to discouraging other investment into the renewable energy market?
I think the thing that we all have to realise is that we are going through a really significant energy transition, and I think, as Mr. Willoughby pointed out, that transition is focused around replacing ageing thermal assets. So regardless of what generation source we choose to replace those assets with, there's a cost, and that we're going to incur that cost. And ideally we want to do it in the lowest cost way, and we do believe that that is in relation, I think, investing in things like wind, long duration storage, pumped hydro, gas. But it's very hard to speculate on exactly when prices will go up and down because there are so many variables.
So you think that's the cheapest form of energy is wind, solar, storage, backed up by gas?
But we certainly support, I think, the investment signals that support investment in those, because we do believe that they will result in a lower cost pathway.
No worries. Thank
Whether
you.
that says that energy is cheaper into the future versus what people are paying now, I think is up for debate.
Thank you. Mr. Burnell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for providing evidence today. I just want to follow on to that discussion around investment into nuclear energy pathways and private investment specifically. Do you think that your membership are going to be knocking on your door when you look at equivalent standards across the world, or examples across the world, where you've got the Flamanville 3, which was a 3.3 billion euro project, blew out to 13.2 billion or 27.6 billion Australian. Hinkley Point C blew out to 89.7 billion. Vogel was 9.7 billion, ended up around 37 billion Australian. Is this part of the reason why the proposal being put forward by the opposition is to be owned by the Australian government
because it's unlikely that private capital is prepared to risk that sort of cost blowout?
I think private capital will look to where the investment signals are pointing to, right? So I think to some extent, capital's technology agnostic, and then it's around, okay, well, what investment signals are going to provide the best return on that capital. I think the challenge we've got, particularly around baseload generation going forward, is that for baseload generation to make a return on investment to warrant, I think, investment from the private sector, it needs to be generating for long periods of time. And we're transitioning into a market that may not need significant amounts of baseload generation, which is why I think a mix of energy sources around wind, long duration storage, and gas, which can flex up and down quite easily, are likely to be better investments for private capital going forward. The other thing that you think you need to remember about the Australian market, and it's quite a unique situation that we're in, is we've got 4 million households with rooftop solar. So we have the highest penetration of rooftop solar installations in the world. And at the moment, those rooftop solar installations combined actually act as one of the largest generators on the grid. So that in itself is displacing significant amounts of existing generation, including coal and particularly baseload generation. So the likelihood of us needing generation sources that run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week into the future is very limited. So unless something like nuclear can begin to flex in a way, and maybe small modular reactors get there at some point, it's unlikely that that investment is going to warrant a significant return.
Thank you for that answer. I guess with the way that people are changing behaviour, or with the way that the energy market's behaviour is changing, is it feasible to think that as domestic consumers become more energy savvy and better energy informed through upgrading to energy efficient appliances, etc., in their households, that then the demand on the greater grid starts to drop off as we see the price in batteries come down, so household storage will start to go up, and then that offset will compensate the rest of the market? Or you got a different view to that?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting. So I think certainly there has been a decline in demand from the energy grid as customers have taken on things like rooftop solar and battery storage over the last 10 years. What we're now seeing in the forecasts coming out from AEMO and others is that there is the potential for that demand to grow again now, and that's predominantly driven by electrification of appliances within the home. Now, if those rates of electrification are realised, in accordance with the forecasts that have been put out, you would actually see quite significant demand growth. And I think if you take into account the potential uptake of electric vehicles into the future and things like that, then I think the other driver is certainly things like data centres and being driven by increasive usage of AI and artificial intelligence. So certainly what we're seeing in the US is that is definitely driving an increase in demand, and it may well be the case for Australia that we actually see some demand growth rather than a continued decline.
Mr. Willoughby, have you got any thoughts on my first question that I put to the Australian Energy Council around private investment into the establishment of nuclear facilities without government support? Is that something that your company would be open to, given the high level of risk?
The national electricity market is a competitive market. What we're focused on, and to be successful in that market, you need to produce the lowest cost electricity that you can. All the analysis that we do, and we're doing it day in, day out, that's the whole core of our business. The answer is always the same. Wind plus solar, batteries, storage, firmed by gas. That is going to be the lowest cost source of electricity generation.
Thank you. What is the unique difference between Australia and, like, we've heard a lot of examples coming that, comparisons to California, to Canada, to Northern Europe. What places Australia so uniquely well to pursue a solar, wind, firmed with storage and pumped hydro, etc.? What places us in that position that's so different to the others? Is it because of daylight hours, because of climatic differences that we don't get the extreme winters that you see in the Northern Hemisphere?
I think every country has different fundamentals, from a population, from a land mass, from natural resources. Australia's really blessed with lots of natural resources, great renewable resources, great wind, great solar. When you look at the size of our land mass, where our population is, the size of our population, it really lends itself to a wind, solar, battery, firmed by gas solution.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else like to comment? Sorry, Chair.
No, I think we would agree with that. So, I think it's making the best of the resources we have, and I think we are very fortunate that we do have the wind and solar resources, and we should be leveraging them.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time today, everyone. If you've been asked to provide any additional